Hi. So I'm making a video here about Judgment Day and about God as well. You can't really have one thing without the other. I suppose it depends on what your definition is. But for many years, I didn't really actually have any strong beliefs. I didn't really think that much of it. I suppose I was sort of wary of being too much involved with any kind of theological ideas just because I'd had some bad experiences of it. And I found some people to be quite judgmental, oddly enough. But maybe that was me being judgmental about other people's beliefs, ironically enough. But I didn't really have any strong sort of beliefs for many years. I guess I was kind of agnostic and just had so many other things going on in the world, just working and studying and worldly kind of things, having friends, socializing, but it's something that I suppose over the last few years more has been on my mind, and so I wanted to sort of read out some of my reflections on it, really, because I think actually what I've come around to believing is that it is a really important thing, and maybe even the important thing, that I've kind of come to view life as a trial, really, and it's a trial in the sense that how we live, the different actions and the way we treat each other is ultimately the evidence that will be used to decide the fate of what happens to us, the consequence. Our faith in God is what leads us to a number of logical conclusions, ones we don't always realise or like to talk openly about. This belief has implications for our relations to our fellow man, that we believe in a God that will judge us, and we will want to warn others where necessary, that the salvation of their soul, the consequence of what will happen to them in the next life, is at stake, that their soul, that our soul, mine too, is at risk. There is a commitment that we will need to confront things that we see as immoral in our life, though we must be cautious to discern what that is and not assume, certainly not with insufficient evidence. In some ways, others whose actions we criticize may view us as fantasists, as mad or delusional. I may have thought that years ago about many people that had such beliefs, in fact. But I would just caution to people before making any kind of decision or judgment even, to take time and consider the reasoning for that and not rush to a verdict. Some people may well, though, assume that what we're saying is just a fantasy or delusional. All the more reason to be certain that behaviour is moral or not, and to take the time to decide, and also not to assume what people's intentions are. They may well think that in our belief and what we say, we're bluffing or merely trying to frighten them with such ideas, perhaps to manipulate them with threats like you risk something happening to your soul or being punished in some way, to try and somehow control what their behaviour is, perhaps. We must be careful not to assume that we know what God's judgment will be, yet we also must be firm in our knowledge that when a behaviour is certainly immoral, there will be some kind of judgment. But more than that, there's a judgment on all our behaviours, even moral ones, actually. If we deny that God is moral in judgment and consequences are real, then we comfort them with a lie and a deception, and ourselves too, by avoiding the potential criticism and the fear of that. Yet critically, it's important to understand judgment is God's judgment, and it's fair and proportionate and balanced, neither too harsh nor too lenient. Whereas many of our judgments over each other are sometimes too harsh or too lenient. It's also important to remember the mercy of God, that any that repent truly can redeem their soul. Thus, although there is the judgment of our immoral actions, there is the chance too of forgiveness, of receiving God's mercy. However, we know that that is conditional. One cannot repent of an immoral act, for example, and still carry on doing it, or support others doing it, enabling them to carry on. There may be other conditions, but we are not able to fully say what they will always entail. Now, here are some reasons why potential warnings about consequences for our souls may be rejected. It may be that they do not believe in such a thing and they believe it is merely fantasy. But belief that it is real or that it is fantasy does not make it true or false of itself. Beliefs often turn out to be wrong, in fact, and one must begin from a position of not knowing, of having no belief either for or against God, or for or against there being a judgment. Note that false beliefs about God and judgment are as much a hindrance as are false beliefs about there being no God or no judgment. Some typical false beliefs about God that may present God as being a tyrannical dictator sometimes, as being overly harsh, yet others mistakenly present God as being all-loving and forgiving of all things, even when people don't ask for forgiveness, and too lenient, therefore. God is always fair in all judgments, though. But do we as humans always know what is fair? When we judge each other quite wrongly because we often lack sufficient evidence to do so, or sometimes lack the compassion to care for each other sufficiently. Another reason that people often give for not believing in God or judgment is a lack of evidence. This is one of the main reasons, of course. Although absence of evidence is not evidence itself for absence, why there is no absolute evidence? Why is that? Except through personal knowledge. If there was proof beyond any doubt, and thus no need for any faith, then that would mean that we know it was a test already. Now think of an example. If you've ever seen it, there was a program called Big Brother when the contestants were on there and they were all too aware that there were cameras filming them, recording their action 24/7. And so they had a tendency to act up for the camera knowingly, and that altered their behaviour differently than they would normally behave on the outside world, where there were no cameras and they weren't aware of being filmed or observed. So when we are aware that we're being observed by others, we are more conscious of our behaviour and adjust it accordingly. If you knew it was a trial and there were consequences, would you only do good just to be rewarded or to avoid any kind of punishment? In a test environment, when one doesn't have absolute proof, it creates more of a genuine test, a real test of the soul. Is it the fear of God that drives one to do the right thing, or the desire to do what's right? Or, just to give you a similar example to the one in Big Brother, if I knew on a certain day at school that there was to be an inspector visiting, do I make an extra effort on that day to try and act as moral as I can to make sure that the children are more well behaved for the inspector's benefit as a kind of show? Whereas if I didn't know that there was an inspection, think of like a mystery shopper. Perhaps if there was a mystery student who was there undercover, who was sort of really analysing, then I wouldn't be able to act because I wouldn't know what day they would be there observing on. So it would be more of a genuine kind of test. If I'm observed, even if I suspect or believe I am or feel I know, it then cannot be said to be a performance, but more the genuine me. It seems too ridiculous to believe is another reason. It may seem an incredible thing to think of a judge or God as having access to being all-knowing. People of faith claim that God is able to sort of be all-knowing, omniscient as it's called. It seems too ridiculous to believe that for some, that a supernatural being could possibly see me at all times, but moreover could see all people at all times. Granted, it would seem quite incredible, extraordinary even, and hard to believe perhaps. But imagine we have today such things as CCTV, surveillance, and it would seem pretty unbelievable to ancient people from thousands of years ago to have such remote viewing as cameras today, things that we take for granted and are quite normal in our modern world. Just as future or extraterrestrial technologies could perhaps seem equally incredible to us today. God, being a spirit, links to our own soul. How much do we really know and understand about our souls? About consciousness, about the unconscious mind even? Even after millenniums, we still don't understand our essence, not in a scientific sense. So, isn't it possible to decide? So, is it possible to decide if it's possible that our soul is somehow linked to God? If we don't truly understand what the soul itself is, then how can we be absolutely sure of that? If we today have the technologies to remote monitor, to track people's movements, to remote watch or to remote listen to other people, is it really that much of a great leap to think that possibly God could already have done all these things and more? Isn't it strange that people thousands of years ago believed in a concept called the all-seeing eye? And they didn't have things like technology, like cameras. So how much easier it is today for us to imagine a more total, integrated surveillance system than one that they could have imagined thousands of years ago without technology. So how did those people, millenniums ago, believe in such a thing without any technological insights that would inspire that kind of belief? And those kind of beliefs certainly weren't believed by everyone, but they were widespread throughout different theologies in different countries in the ancient world. And you can read various different accounts of those, and that's one of the symbols in ancient Egypt of the all-seeing eye. In fact, there are many other symbols. Another common objective is that people that believe in Judgment Day or God are only wishful thinking, that believers or knowers only want it to be true. Now, whilst there might be some truth in this, especially if one has been wronged by others and feels aggrieved, and that it's not recognised by others, that they want vindication or some compensatory justice. Likewise, it has perhaps Likewise, if one has perhaps done some virtue that has equally not been recognised by others, yet since we all do some wrong, we all are compromised in different ways, and all therefore are in need of confession and repentance, and making what I would call a mercy deal with God, which involves certain conditions to improve upon our behaviour. Would someone really wish to be held accountable, to have their bad deeds exposed, and have to perhaps change their life too, even with the possibility of some consequences in whatever those conditions might be. One might just have wished for a God that has no rules of morality, or rules that only conform to our own understanding of that, or none that condemns us in any significant way, and that does not mean that we would risk any shame and the potential hard work of having to transform our lives in some way. Of course, one might argue people wish judgment and condemnation on their perceived enemies, or those that they may feel aggrieved at. But then there is also the double-edged sword of God's mercy. Does one wish mercy on one that one may feel anger at or upset with? That may depend upon the grievance and the disposition of the aggrieved. Yet just as one would naturally struggle with their own condemnation and judgment, or mercy being granted to a perceived enemy, one would certainly, however, wish for mercy for oneself, and perhaps condemnation of those that one has felt oppressed by. So this claim that people believing in Judgment Day are only wishful thinkers is at best only half true. There's some truth perhaps in that, but not the whole truth, because it's certainly not all of what one would wish for at all. Too often, a warning of judgment can be patronising or condescending, assuming the person giving it is self-righteous. Yet what if the person themselves was also a sinner and was able to admit to the sins that they had done? If they were perhaps someone that had admitted to many wrongs, that they were prone to selfishness and arrogance and occasional flights of drunken madness and narcissism, then the message is not, you must learn to be more moral and improve your behaviour or face some consequences, but instead it becomes, we all must learn to improve our own conduct or face some consequences. Of course, the fact that we all do sin sometimes, we harm others unnecessarily with intention, or we don't help them out as much as we could do, that doesn't therefore imply either that we all do the same kinds of sin, nor necessarily the same amount of sin. Of course, that necessarily provokes the real question at the heart of this: what actually is a sin? Because whilst there is a consensus with some people on some things, there are as many debatable areas still to discern. Thus, it's important not to assume something necessarily is a sin because we ourselves view it as that. It's important to try and look at it as objectively as possible, and making sure that those rules are consistent. My own understanding seems to be a sin is something whereby it causes intentional and unnecessary harm to others. But I wonder if that would accord to other people's beliefs of what a sin is. That brings us nicely to the next common objection, and that is moral relativism. The belief that all so-called morality is merely a construct either of the individual or perhaps of the wider social influence that we're surrounded by. There certainly are some grey areas. Indeed, there are many, but one can think of numerous obvious examples where something would be immoral no matter what individual did it or whatever culture it happened to occur within. I'm thinking of a particularly awful scenario, something abominable, like perhaps the rape and murder of a young child, something that surely would be considered immoral, regardless of who did it and regardless of where it was done. And that would be surely true for any century or millennium, continent or country, and according to whoever. I suppose one might think of extreme cases where someone may be forced to do something or was perhaps psychotic and not really responsible. But one must be wary of trying to blame others or of avoiding our responsibility by blaming perhaps even our own disabilities. In order to make a fair assessment and judgment, one would need to know what someone's actual capabilities were. And there are various ways of doing such assessments. In my definition of a sin, I mention causing intentional harm to others, because it may be that one causes harm but does not intend to harm, or didn't understand the consequences of his actions, as does indeed happen. Think of a man that kills a pedestrian through the recklessness of his drink driving. Yes, he may still be guilty through his bad actions, but still not quite as guilty and culpable to the extent that a murderer who has premeditated his actions would be. Think of another example, somebody that's brought up in a very violent household at a very young age, and that's all that he's known. He's got very limited experiences within his life and goes on to commit a violent act against somebody else. If that's all he's known within his life, you probably would judge him more leniently than someone who's much older and maybe hasn't experienced violence at a young age and has experienced many other non-violent actions and is much more well equipped to know what's right and wrong, moral behaviour. So you can think of many cases. For example, in terms of moral relativism, that is a real extreme position to take, that there are no such things as any absolute morals. And the other opposite extreme to that is whereby we assume an absolute moralism. Moral absolutism is the opposite extreme of moral relativism. And moral absolutism, it basically assumes that we have a monopoly over understanding what morality is. It assumes that we totally know in every situation what's a morally right thing and wrong thing to do. Whereas, in fact, we can think of many dubious cases that are debatable. You might think of, for example, a civilian death in a war, where there may be some people disputing whether it is a murder, manslaughter, or whether it is, in fact, an accidental death. And that may be down to the actual context and the particular case and the actual details of the specific case. But you can think of many cases that could be disputable and unknown. And so we should be as wary of moral absolutism, of assuming we always know what is right and wrong conduct in a situation. But that then doesn't imply that there are no moralities, that there is nothing moral and not a moral dimension. Otherwise, we could just assume that anything could be done to anyone and it's fair game, couldn't we? And therefore, and I pretty much hope no one would want that. I certainly wouldn't want anyone to be tortured or harmed excessively without any real reason, to be caused any horrific violence. I think there's a good reason that we do have some moral codes of conduct to protect people and to prevent such harm happening. And there's good reason to have that, because we don't want to harm other people. We want to prevent excessive harms. And if harms are done to other people, they need to be justified that it was a necessary thing to do. Of course, do we always know what a man's intentions are? Sometimes we can assess those and be sure. Other times it's harder to do that, though. Sometimes we don't know what is morally right. There may be some contest or debate over the issue, like I mentioned. Since we are all learning in this life, we're all students of life, although perhaps teaching students. Since we are all learning, None of us have an absolute knowledge of what's always the right thing to do. Yet to deny there is a moral dimension to life is to deny life its meaning in the truest and most fulfilling sense of the word. We've all experienced both good and bad moral behaviours from other people, and therefore we know how that can feel and affect to us. To deny there is any moral dimension is to deny yourself. Who would choose to be harmed and tortured, for example? Who would choose that for friends or families, or for strangers even? We all want moral rights for ourselves, of course. Only a suicidal nihilist or completely mad person in psychosis would think otherwise. Moral relativists sometimes take that position as a reaction and a fear towards moral absolutism, when we wrongly claim that we have that monopoly in understanding moral conduct and attempt to impose our own understandings on what might be a disputed occasion. Now, moving swiftly on to the next objection, could it be a threat that people make up Judgment Day merely to try and scare us, or just to manipulate or control our behaviour somehow? Now, while some people do use it in that manner, that's true, perhaps assuming that they know God's judgment and are pronouncing what they want other people to feel. I've heard many people say all sorts of proclamations. I've had it myself, being told that I'm going to hell, and I've heard many people say that. I've even heard people say some people will be going to an everlasting torment or something like that. And that, of course, an infinite punishment. Surely, for a finite sin, that must surely be an excessive and disproportionate kind of judgment, and not one that you would associate with a fair and proportionate judgment. One must be cautious not to assume that we know necessarily the nature or the extent of what a judgment will entail. Yet the fact that some pronounce harsh or excessive judgments, or lenient ones, that doesn't negate that there may be consequences still for us if we persist knowingly in an immoral act against others. So, of course, other people do want to manipulate us by using these things sometimes. But that then doesn't necessarily logically imply that just because people use something and exaggerate things sometimes, that there isn't some truth beyond their exaggerations of it. One may question, why does one give a warning to another? Is it because they are driven by some anger, perhaps? Or could it be out of concern? Is it a friend that sees something harmful that you're doing and might actually want to give you some sort of warning to prevent you from harming yourself? If you view harming other people, as Socrates did, as actually harming your soul, that you are not fulfilling the true potential of living up to the greatest value, of living up to your own values that you could. We would all want to be warned, but at the same time, is there any point telling people something if they know that something's wrong already? Then perhaps not. I guess one must discern whether it makes sense to say something to someone in a given situation. But just because someone gives you a warning doesn't necessarily mean that they don't care about you, or that they're angry, or they're driven by, a feeling of superiority, wanting it to lord over you, or to be condescending and speak down to you. It may well be that they have concern for you, and in the same way that they would want you to have concern for them too, and they want to be held accountable to the same rules. That would depend on whether they are consistent in applying the same kind of moral rules to themselves that they apply to others, of course. There's an old saying, of course, that The wounds of a friend are perhaps better than the kisses of a stranger. A basic question would be, how do you know there is a God, though? And also, by implication, how do you know there is a judgment? One might say that it's through our own personal experiences, that are our life experiences, which make up our evidence. In a sense, evidence for other people can only be their life experiences and not other people's, just as my life experiences are my evidence. Yet one might mention the vast number of many coincidences that we do experience within our life. How do we explain those? What Carl Jung termed as synchronicity. Something that I, and through conversations, have learned many others experience. Something that is so obscure and unusual to be so against the odds statistically. Something that is just so incredible. I've had so many experiences like that. I wish I'd made more accurate recordings of them over the years. One might see evidence too in the experience of something called grace. Think of all the many times in life when you've had perhaps a near accident or even a near-death experience that was somehow almost miraculously averted. It's happened to me so many countless times. I can just recall off the top of my head where I almost had collisions with cars, so many numerous occasions where there but for the grace of God go I. And I, wonder, it's a wonder that I'm alive sometimes today, really. Although sometimes we're so tempted to look at the many tragedies that there are in life and the awful things that can happen to us and that do happen to people in life. But sometimes we overlook the vast number of different wonderful things that can also happen to us. And the number of times that in actual fact we have such near death or near life experiences, you might call them. And I've witnessed so many of those over the years, actually. And I've met so many other people that claim to as well, oddly enough. But think of all the many inspiring things as well. The many things that have happened in your life, the many people that you've met. Question, is it just purely chance alone that you've met these people? Or would you think that somehow there is some purpose, some underlying meaning, not just to the people and relationships you've had, but the different events and the different things that have happened to you, the different experiences that we've had, different places that we've visited, different jobs that we've worked. Is there some underlying purpose and meaning to life? There's not a question that you can answer simply by just taking a few minutes or hours. It can't be rushed like that. It's something that deserves, to do the question justice, deserves to take appropriate time to really truly reflect on it, because it is a question that needs to be studied over a long time. You can't study your entire life's experiences in such a short, rushed time, Who can, We go through such a wealth of different experiences. We accumulate, not just over months, weeks, years, decades, perhaps lifetimes, as well as argument from personal experience. One might say that life itself has some sort of underlying meaning sometimes. Not that we always know what that is. And life can sometimes, admittedly, seem meaningless. Sometimes it can seem quite empty of meaning, But because we don't always understand the reason for something, doesn't mean, therefore, by implication, that there is no meaning. It may be that we just don't know entirely what it is, and we still have things to find out and discover. But the many differing relationships, people's professions, those things can help to give our life meaning. Of course, that's not to deny that we sometimes do act like life is meaningless. People do, we all do sometimes. We may do something for no purpose, or others may. But if I act madly, does that imply that there is no sense of sanity in life? If I were to go out and murder someone, or even if I was to be murdered, does that act alone mean that there is no such thing as morality, therefore? We need to be cautious about how we employ logic. Yes, there can be immoral things that happen in life, but that doesn't mean that there aren't also some moral things as well sometimes. Yes, we can struggle to find meaning sometimes, and things can seem meaningless sometimes, but that doesn't mean that there isn't also sometimes a sense of meaning as well other times. Of course, meaning itself isn't just something that happens to us without effort, without participation. If we are actively engaged within something purposefully, then it's not only that we see meaning in the world, but that we are striving to become meaningful, to live meaningfully, and perhaps even ultimately to die meaningfully. Now I'm going to come on to a slightly different but related subject that involves really discussing God and judgment. And it's really an issue that I feel like is really strongly related, and that is of creationism. The dispute over creationism versus evolution